He thought it would be just another stop, a moment of control, another face behind the wheel. But what started as a show of authority quickly turned into something far greater. Under the bright midday sun, his arrogance met its reckoning. Because the man he mocked wasn't just any driver. He was the one who could end his career. What unfolded next would expose more than prejudice. It would reveal what happens when power meets accountability. It was a bright afternoon in downtown Atlanta, the kind that shimmered with heat rising off the asphalt. Jaden Miles had just left his office at the Justice Department after another long morning reviewing policy drafts and misconduct reports. For years, he'd worked quietly behind the scenes, overseeing reforms meant to make law enforcement more accountable. A job that often put him in direct conflict with the kind of officers who believed they were untouchable. But for Jaden, today wasn't about work. It was about getting home early for once, about keeping his promise to have dinner with his daughter before her graduation rehearsal. He loosened his tie as he merged onto a quieter suburban road, the city fading in his rearview mirror. The hum of the engine and the soft rhythm of a jazz station filled the car, blending into a rare moment of calm. His mind drifted toward the weekend, to family, to peace. The kind of peace he rarely allowed himself to feel. Then came the sudden flash of red and blue lights behind him. The sound of the sirens sliced through the air like a blade. Jaden's hands instinctively gripped the steering wheel tighter. No speeding, no signal missed, no reason at all. Yet, the unmistakable sound of authority echoed closer. He eased the sedan to the side of the road, glancing at the side mirror as the patrol car pulled up behind him. Two shapes moved inside, one getting out, heavy boots crunching the gravel. Jaden felt the old familiar tension crawl up his spine, the one that came not from guilt, but from experience. He took a slow breath, straightened his posture, and waited. He didn't know it yet. But this stop, under the warm daylight of an ordinary afternoon, was about to become the moment that would expose everything he stood for. The officer stepped out of the cruiser with the kind of confidence that came from power, or the illusion of it. His sunglasses caught the sunlight as he adjusted his belt, one hand resting near his holster, the other already holding authority in the form of a badge. Officer Raymond Clark, early 30s, sharp jawline and sharper assumptions. Jaden watched him approach through the side mirror, his pulse steady, but his expression unreadable. He'd seen this posture before. The same calculated dominance, the same look that turned curiosity into suspicion just because of the color of a man's skin. He rolled down the window before the officer could knock. License and registration. The words came clipped, rehearsed. But there was an undertone Jaden didn't miss. He handed them over without hesitation, his movements calm and deliberate. Clark studied the documents longer than necessary, his gaze flicking from the ID to Jaden's face, as if waiting for something not to match. "Where are you headed?" Clark asked finally, glancing toward the back seat, his tone carrying that thin layer of skepticism too familiar to mistake. "Home," Jaden replied evenly. "Just left work," Clark's brows arched. "Work, huh? And what kind of work would that be?" The question hung in the air. Not out of curiosity, but provocation. Jaden could feel it. He'd spent years training others to recognize these moments. The subtle shift where authority stopped being about law and started being about ego. "Government," Jaden answered simply. That single word seemed to irritate Clark. His lips tightened and his gaze grew colder. "Step out of the car." Jaden's knuckles flexed slightly against the steering wheel. "Is there a reason for that, officer?" Clark smirked, the kind of smirk meant to remind someone who was supposedly in charge. "You fit the description," he said vaguely. "Just routine, routine." Jaden had heard that word too many times. The shield used to justify humiliation. Still, he opened the door, stepping out into the sunlight. His posture remained calm, his tone measured. The officer circled him slowly, inspecting him like a suspect, not a citizen. The silence between them grew heavy. Nearby, cars passed by, their drivers unaware that history, the same old story, was replaying itself on the side of this road. Clark stopped in front of Jaden. "Hands where I can see them." Jaden complied, his calm almost unnerving to the officer. Clark began a slow, deliberate pat-down, unnecessarily rough, lingering too long. Jaden's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He knew reacting would only feed the officer's arrogance. "Traveling in a nice car like this," Clark muttered, glancing at the sedan. "Must be good money in whatever you do." Jaden didn't reply. He let the silence do the talking. It was louder than words. Clark leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You people sure have a way of getting lucky, don't you?" The words hit like a slap, but Jaden didn't flinch. Inside, anger burned steady, not fiery, but cold, controlled. The kind that didn't explode, but waited for the right moment to speak. "Nothing illegal here," Clark said finally, stepping back. "But you seemed nervous. Anything you want to tell me before I run this?" Jaden's eyes met his. Calm, steady. "Only that you're making a mistake." Clark frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Before Jaden could answer, another cruiser pulled up. A second officer approached, older, observing quietly. Clark straightened instantly, pretending professionalism. The second officer greeted Jaden politely, then glanced at the ID in Clark's hand. "Wait, this guy works for the Justice Department," the second officer murmured, realizing the insignia embossed on the ID holder. Clark froze. His smirk vanished. But Jaden's expression didn't change. Just that same calm composure, as if he had been waiting for the truth to surface on its own. The air around them shifted. For the first time, Clark's authority faltered, and Jaden, still standing in the sunlight, knew. This wasn't just about one man with a badge. It was about every time someone believed power meant permission. The silence that followed was suffocating. Officer Clark's hand hovered uncertainly over the badge in his grasp, his mind racing to reconcile what he'd just learned. The name on the ID, Jaden Miles, Federal Department of Justice Oversight Division. His confidence cracked like glass. The smirk that once defined his face was gone, replaced by a sudden, heavy stillness. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The older officer glanced between them, sensing the unraveling tension. Jaden didn't move. Didn't need to. His stillness spoke louder than anger ever could. The power dynamic had flipped completely. And now, under the glaring daylight, the officer who once commanded fear found himself shrinking under his own actions. Clark stepped back slightly, trying to recover his authority. "I didn't realize who you were." Jaden's eyes locked on his. Calm, unwavering. "You shouldn't need to know who someone is to treat them with respect." The words struck harder than any confrontation. They weren't loud, but they carried weight, the kind that lingers, heavy and permanent. The second officer shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. "Sir, maybe we can—" But Jaden raised a hand, silencing him without a word. The faint sound of a nearby car passing filled the tense air, like the world was still turning while this single moment stood frozen in time. Clark's breathing quickened. He looked everywhere except at Jaden. For the first time, he felt what it was like to be seen, not as an officer, not as authority, but as the embodiment of everything broken in the system he served. "I'll be reporting this stop," Jaden said evenly, his tone composed, yet cutting. "Not because of who I am, but because of what you've done." Clark nodded slowly, shame flooding his face, the weight of realization finally sinking in. Jaden turned toward his car, the sun catching the faint glint of his badge as he opened the door. He paused, looked back once, and said quietly, "Next time, remember, the uniform doesn't make you powerful. Your actions do," and with that, he drove off, leaving behind an officer stripped of arrogance and a silence that felt heavier than any punishment. The drive home was silent, but Jaden's mind wasn't. The sunlight that once felt warm now seemed harsh, reflecting off the windshield like a mirror of everything wrong with the world he had just confronted. He had faced bias before, in meetings, in policy debates, in quiet moments where respect was a performance, not a principle. But this time, it was different. This time, he wasn't just a witness to injustice. He was its target. As the city skyline appeared in the distance, Jaden's reflection stared back at him. Not angry, not defeated, but resolute. He had spent years fixing systems from within, signing reports and approving reforms. But now, he understood something those reports could never show. The weight of humiliation. The quiet violence of being reduced to a stereotype. The next morning, Jaden arrived at his office earlier than usual. On his desk sat the file he'd opened countless times before. Officer Misconduct Review Committee. But this time, there was a new name on top. Officer Raymond Clark. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply began to write. Every word was calm, factual, and precise. Not driven by anger, but by purpose. What happened on that sunlit road would not disappear into bureaucracy. It would become the example that forced change. Weeks later, reforms began to move faster. Officers received retraining, accountability measures tightened, and the department started listening in ways it hadn't before. The story spread quietly. Another incident that became a turning point. For Jaden, it wasn't victory. It was vindication. Proof that silence helps no one, and that dignity, even in the face of injustice, can be its own form of protest. Because racism doesn't always come in shouts or violence. Sometimes it hides behind a badge, a smirk, or a question asked with the wrong intent. And until those moments are seen, named, and changed, stories like this will keep repeating. So the real question isn't whether Jaden made a difference, it's whether we will. Don't miss more powerful real-life stories. Hit subscribe now.